Well, hey there, Elevate friends and family. Great to have you with us today as we launch a brand new series called Anxious for Nothing. And we're very intentional when it comes to choosing our message series. Ultimately, our goal in teaching is to be helpful, not merely interesting, helpful. And helpful in a way that whatever we teach can be taken away and applied Monday to Sunday in every sphere of your life. And so I really hope and I really believe that this series is going to be incredibly helpful for a lot of people. And I want to actually just jump straight in to the slice of something that Paul wrote that we're actually taking the title of this series from. So if you've got your smartphone, how about you scan this flow code? And it's going to take you to the Bible app and straight to Philippians chapter 4. And I want to drop us into verse 6. Now, just to give it a little bit of context, Paul wrote this letter. Paul was a kind of a heavyweight entrepreneur of the early church. And he wrote this letter to a place called Philippi, which is in eastern Greece, to the church there. And so it was a letter of encouragement, letter of instruction. And what we're going to drop into is really towards the very end of the letter as he's kind of wrapping things up. And Paul wrote this, and I mean, check this out. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And you might think, well, okay, Paul, that's easy for you to say, mate, but you don't know my situation. You don't know the stuff that I'm dealing with. You don't know my family of origin. Let me tell you something if you didn't already know this. Paul was writing this letter and wrote this letter whilst he was in prison. Imprisoned by the Roman army, the Roman Empire, for preaching about Jesus. And he wrote this letter at a time in his life where he didn't know if he was going to ever be set free. He didn't know if he was going to die in prison. He didn't know if he was going to be executed. And he, from that, I mean, if anyone's got a reason to be anxious, and from that situation, Paul wrote those words. In fact, let me zoom out and give you like that notion of do not be anxious about anything. That was sandwiched in between two other seemingly absurd, preposterous, unbelievable, unachievable things. Let me show you. Rejoice. Did I mention that Paul's writing this from prison? Rejoice in the Lord always. And I'll say it again. Rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Now, if you've ever been anxious about anything, you would know that the dream scenario is that you would instead experience peace. But that's not always the natural gravitational pull. And so I guess I don't know, can we just be honest here for a second? Is it okay to ask the question, Paul, God, are these things even possible? Rejoice when you're in prison or facing circumstances that are just terrifying, overwhelming. Don't be anxious about anything. I mean, anything. And then finally, as a consequence and something that we can live in is have the peace of God guard our hearts at all time. I mean, is this even possible? Or had Paul been, I don't know, eating too much lousy prison food? You know that anxiety is the most common mental health condition in Australia, with 1 in 4 people experiencing it at some point in their lives. And there's similar stats in other developed and developing countries. You know, it could be acute anxiety, something that's kind of triggered by like a health issue, maybe a relationship challenge, busy or burdensome financial season, maybe decisions your kids are making are causing you to be anxious. You know, and these things can actually then spiral into more chronic anxiety and play out in things like sleeplessness and panic attacks and more. And so, yes, we're definitely aiming this series at people who have or who do struggle with and wrestle with anxiety and anxious thoughts. But if you don't, I really, can I invite you to hang in here? Don't tune out. Don't shut it down like, well, that's other people's. And I want to invite you to journey with us as well for 2 reasons. Number one, there is still in 2022 a stigma attached to things like anxiety and depression. You know, people are looked upon as being weak. You know, well, they can't handle life. And by the way, even in the church, there's another layer added to it, where people who struggle with and are wrestling with anxiety and depression can be looked at and maybe even accused of not having enough faith, which just kind of adds to the mess. And so as a church, we consistently put these sorts of topics on the table so that they're not buried away. Because if they're not on the table, people who struggle with these mental health issues, if they can't put them on the table, then the risk is they'll just kind of sweep them under the carpet, or they themselves will retreat, or they themselves will pretend that everything's fine when it's not. And so as a church, we want to be a church that wears our big boy pants and our big girl pants and is thrilled to be talking about this sort of stuff, thrilled to be having conversations about these sorts of matters, thrilled to be able to help one another because things are out on the table in the light. So journey with us to ensure that you and I, that we, if you don't wrestle with some mental health type issues, can be big in the space. And then a very natural flow on from that is there's an opportunity for you to learn how to be a better friend to someone who is wrestling with this sort of stuff. A better boss, a better colleague, a better spouse, a better parent, a better child, a better neighbor, a better fellow student, because you have grown your understanding of the most common mental health issue in Australia. So I want to drop you into a slice of history framed around a guy named Elijah. Now, Elijah was a prophet, which is like a Bible word for like a spokesperson for God. And he lived in a time where the king was a guy named Ahab, King Ahab, and King Ahab was a pretty bad dude. Didn't honor God, the God of the Israelites, was kind of prone to worshipping other idols and so on. And God wasn't happy, because God doesn't like to be made number 2 or less. And God nudged Elijah to go and speak to King Ahab, speak truth to power, which takes some courage, and tell King Ahab that there's going to be a drought in his kingdom, and it's going to last for years, and it's going to negatively impact his entire kingdom. The economy is going to be ruined. Well, you know, that started to happen, and King Ahab wasn't very happy in response. Not with God, and certainly not with Elijah. And so he put out like a bounty, sent his armies after Elijah, and so Elijah went on the run. Went on the run for 3 years, during which time God provided for him supernaturally, but like in a Hollywood movie kind of supernatural way. God would provide and did provide bread and meats that just kind of appeared. Elijah raised people from the dead during this time as a demonstration that the God of Israel is more powerful than any other idol. Steve Hall last week took us into a slice of Elijah's history where Elijah stood toe-to-toe with 850 false prophets of a god named Baal and other idols, and stood toe-to-toe with them and won. You know, him and the God of Israel just made these 850 false prophets look stupid. And so this has been Elijah's experience for the entire time that he was on the run. For 3 years, he had just seen God show up again and again and again, but like not show up in a little way, but show up in this kind of phenomenal way. And yet, Elijah, who'd experienced God's provision and God's presence and God's power, still struggled with anxiety. So it's not a lack of faith, just in case anyone's ever told you that. So let me drop you into another slice of Elijah's life. All this stuff has happened. The armies hadn't caught him. And if you thought that King Ahab was a bad dude, let me introduce you to his wife. And by the way, if you've ever heard of someone being referred to as a Jezebel, like, it's not a compliment. Well, that name or that insult comes from Ahab's wife, Jezebel. And she'd looked at Ahab and she'd looked at the armies, and they'd failed to capture and kill Elijah for 3 years. And so she's like, all right, I'm going to just look, get out of my way. I'm going to take care of this. Well, when Elijah saw how things were, he ran for dear life to Beersheba, far south of Judah. He left his young servant there, and then he went on into the desert, another day's journey. Came upon a lone broom bush and collapsed in the shade, wanting in the worst way to be done with it all, to just die. Enough of this, God. Take my life. I'm ready to join my ancestors in the grave. In case you missed it, Elijah's fear and anxiety had grown so severe that he concluded in his mind that the only way to escape death from Jezebel was to be put to death by God. So he's trying to run from death, and he thinks, well, the way I run from death is by being killed. It doesn't make any sense. And here's a little insight into anxiety, that anxiety kind of doesn't make sense. I mean, there may be triggers that are real, but this is kind of the point, and this is why it can become so consuming and so dark, because it's like, I can't get outside of this. I can't get beyond this. It's not rational, but I'm kind of stuck here. And this was like Elijah, where he's at, and he just said to God, enough of this. And that's the title of today's message, When You've Had Enough. And I wonder if you've ever been there. You know, the bills have been piling up, and you've been feeling stress, and you've been feeling some anxiety in your financial space, and then something breaks, or an unexpected bill comes, and it just tips you over the edge, and you're like, I've had enough of this. Maybe it's a busy season at work, and you're just getting there. And one of your kids gets sick and requires you to take time off, and it's just like, no, that's my breaking point. I've had enough. You know, maybe you've been trying to make things work in a relationship, you know, a marriage or a parent or a friend. And then just, you know, something is said that's just like not cool. And it just takes you over the edge. And you want to say, that's it. I've had enough. Well, getting to that place where you might think and you might start to conclude and you might even start to declare, like Elijah did, that you've had enough, it doesn't start there. It starts upstream. And here's a few mistakes that Elijah made in his undeniably high pressure situation. First of all, he isolated himself. I mean, he left his land. He left where he was in hiding, but it was still within contact of friends and family. And he went to Beersheba. It's 100 miles away, which in those days might as well have been on another planet. And then when he got there, by the way, he took his servant with him, but then he decided, no, I'm going to jettison my servant and I'm going to go further away by myself into the desert. Now, when you're feeling overwhelmed, it's actually kind of important to edit, to create some margin, to create some breathing space, because initially the goal is just to get into survival mode, where you're like, okay, I don't know what my options are beyond this, but at least I can acknowledge that this isn't the end. And that is going to allow me maybe to get a bit of clarity and a bit of objectivity. But that's not what Elijah did. He went away completely on his own. And that's not good, to be completely alone and completely alone with your thoughts when you're feeling anxious, when you're experiencing anxiety. You know, that's why God calls us to do life together as a church, so that when one person is struggling, other people can be strong with them. That's why God gives us access to professionals. You know, sometimes anxiety is caused by circumstances, and it could be, therefore, that the best person to reach out to is a trained counselor or therapist. Sometimes some anxiety and depression is caused by some chemical imbalances, and so the best person professionally to reach out to might be an MD or a psychiatrist. Sometimes it's some nutritional imbalances. You know, too much of the bad stuff, not enough of the good stuff, affects brain chemistry, and the best person to reach out to is like a naturopath or a nutritionist. Whichever it is, and it could be a combination of some or all of the above, the takeaway is wise people get help from wise people. They don't isolate themselves from helpers. They might isolate themselves from the cause of the problem just to give themselves that breathing room, but they don't isolate themselves from helpers. Then Elijah went on to allow his negative thoughts to dominate. So again, remember, Elijah had had these years of God showing up, of God demonstrating his power, his provision, his presence. And yet, despite that, that wasn't the narrative that he allowed to dominate in his mind. The narrative that he allowed to dominate was all the negative stuff. Enough of this, God, take my life. You know, things are never going to get better. This is it for me. You know, I've lost hope, and I'm pretty sure, God, you can't help me either. So let's just end it. And then a close cousin of that is that Elijah forgot God's faithfulness. That we're never without hope when we reach out to God. Now, when I read a little bit of that letter that Paul wrote to the church in Philippi, I kind of buried the lead. So let me go back to that. Rejoice in the Lord always. I'll say it again. Rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. And here's the key. The Lord is near. And thankfully, while Elijah tried to run away, wherever he went, God was still near. And so God sent an angel to Elijah to speak to him and to provide for him, again, some bread, some water supernaturally, and instructed him to go to a place known as the Mountain of God, which was ultimately a 40-day journey. So get moving. Like, stop isolating yourself. Let's go. But let's go to the Mountain of God and go stand on the mountain at attention before God, and God will pass by. Well, a hurricane wind ripped through the mountains and shattered the rocks before God, but God wasn't to be found in the wind. And after a wind, an earthquake, but God wasn't in the earthquake. And then after the earthquake, fire, but God wasn't in the fire. And after the fire, a gentle and quiet whisper. So there's earthquakes, there's wind and storms, there's fire going crazy here. And those are the things that are disruptive, and those are the things that so easily get our attention. But that's not where God was, and that's not what God used to ultimately speak to Elijah. And I'll let you read on for yourself what happened next, and it's incredible. But God was in a gentle and quiet whisper. And so here's the clue. Anxiety shouts. Worry shouts. Fear shouts. The devil shouts. Your negative narrative about yourself shouts. Your challenging circumstances shout. And it's easy to give them our attention. It's easy to rubberneck to them. And yet all the while, God is near and God is whispering. And as best we can, again, through the help of friends and the church, professionals, to create the space to be able to hear, push back the noise and hear the quiet and gentle whisper of the God who is near. Now, we're going to take this series over 4 weeks, and I want us to take a really deep dive. This is such an important topic. So we're going to, every week, go through a featured plan in the Bible app together. So look, there's a QR code on the screen here. Grab your phone, scan that. It's going to take you to the Bible app, and it's going to allow you to make Elevate Church my church in the Bible app. And then every Monday, we're going to post a featured plan. It's like a Bible plan, Bible study, devotional kind of thing. It's called a plan in the Bible app. And we're going to post one every Monday, and we're going to just go through that together to take a deeper dive into the topic that we preached about. And so tomorrow we'll be dropping in a featured plan called Overcoming an Anxious Mind, where we can look at more of what God has to say about overcoming anxiety. So look, we'll see you back here online next week. I hope bring someone that needs to hear this, and absolutely make Elevate Church your church in the Bible app, and join us each week working through and walking through the plans, and let's grow in this area